welcome to the deep dive. Before we even get into the material today, do us a massive favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, please do. It really helps.
It genuinely does, and it guarantees you never miss the really detailed source material we unpack here.
Exactly.
So today we are taking you on, well, an extensive, highly granular journey into an ebook. It's titled The New Macho, A Guide to Remasculinity in a Femme-Dominant Society by Conrad Riker.
Quite a title.
Right? And look, if you want to follow along or if you just want to dive into the source material for yourself, head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to buy the book.
And you can find the author too.
Yes. Make sure to follow the author at the handle at Conrad Riker. That's CONRADNRIKER on Substack.
It is a really dense, very provocative read. And to give you, the listener, the necessary context, before we start unpacking the mechanics of these arguments, we need to define the target audience.
Yeah, we have to set the stage.
Right, because this text is explicitly written for men's rights activists, often referred to as MRAs, and specifically men who identify with the red-pilled manosphere.
The manosphere, yeah.
The entire architectural theme of the book is an exploration of the history of modern institutions. We were talking about marriage, the educational system, the corporate workplace.
The big ones.
Exactly. And the core claim the author makes is that these institutions have been systematically captured and dismantled by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Which brings us to a really important point. Because of the specific, highly charged nature of this text, we need to issue a strict, unequivocal neutrality disclaimer right out of the gate.
Super important today.
We're about to cover deeply polarizing political and cultural material. So to be crystal clear, we are never taking any sides here.
None at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the sociological conclusions of this content. Our sole mission today is to impartially report on the contents of this ebook and convey the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material.
Think of us simply as your guides.
Right, guides through the landscape of this author's worldview. We are analyzing the logic the book uses to build its case, without any judgment, endorsement, or condemnation on our part.
Because our overarching goal here is synthesis and comprehension. Knowledge becomes valuable when the underlying mechanics of a perspective are understood thoroughly.
Especially with cultural battlegrounds like this.
Exactly. It is essential to understand the exact arguments shaping these large, sweeping conversations, regardless of your personal stance. So we're going to break down Riker's thesis, examining the foundational premises and following them all the way through to his proposed solutions.
Let's start with that foundational premise. The book opens by identifying what Riker calls a crisis of emasculation.
Right in the preface.
Yeah, right out of the gate in the preface in the first chapter, he sets the stage by arguing that modern society is suffering from widespread systemic emasculation.
But he makes a very specific point about this.
He does. He says this isn't some accidental byproduct of the digital age or changing economic tides. The book posits that this is the deliberate result of a culture that no longer values traditional masculine roles.
He claims society now treats masculinity itself as a pathology.
Like a disease.
Exactly. A problem that needs to be diagnosed and cured rather than a vital, necessary component of human civilization.
So how does he build that argument?
The way Riker frames this is by treating it not just as a cultural shift, but as a biological betrayal. He roots his entire foundational argument in evolutionary biology.
Okay, so going back to human nature.
Right. He operates on the premise that masculinity is not a fluid social construct that can just be rewritten by academic theory.
It's hardwired.
Yes. He argues it's a set of evolutionary adaptations designed to optimize men as providers and protectors.
I want to pause on that definition for a second because the modern mainstream narrative often conflates traditional masculinity with inherent aggression or domination, or even senseless violence. How does Riker separate his biological argument from that mainstream perception?
He forcefully pushes back against that conflation. Riker argues that labeling the male biological imperative as inherently aggressive is a deliberate mischaracterization.
So he views it differently.
Entirely. In his framework, these male biological drives are actually rooted in a profound sense of duty, burden sharing, and responsibility.
Burden sharing. That's an interesting phrase.
It's key for him. He points out that it is precisely these instincts, the drive to build, to protect the perimeter, to organize chaos into order, that allowed humanity to construct cities, explore the oceans, and create functional empires.
So it's a creative force, not just a destructive one.
Exactly. He views the protective instinct not as a desire to conquer for the sake of cruelty, but as a mechanism to create safe environments for families and societies to flourish.
So the book suggests that modern society is basically telling men to suppress the exact operating system that built the society in the first place.
That's his core grievance, yes.
Which brings up a really fascinating concept he introduces in Chapter 8. He calls it the vulnerability paradox.
This is a huge part of his argument.
On the surface, the modern cultural message to men is often, you need to be more in touch with your emotions. You need to open up. You need to cry.
Right, the therapy speak.
Yeah, exactly. So how does Riker argue that this seemingly empathetic push is actually an assault on men?
He describes it as a deeply insidious psychological double bind. The paradox relies on the idea that society demands men act like women emotionally,
Meaning what, exactly?
meaning they are expected to process, vocalize, and display feelings in a distinctly feminine manner. However, Riker argues that society simultaneously punishes or instantly loses respect for those same men when they display authentic male vulnerability.
What does authentic male vulnerability look like in this context, though? And how is it punished?
According to the text, when men open up about their specific struggles, perhaps feelings of inadequacy in providing the pressure of expectations or the pain of alienation in a way that is true to their masculine nature, the reaction is rarely empathy.
It's weaponized against them.
Riker claims they are met with ridicule. They're deemed weak or told their problems are invalid because they theoretically possess systemic privilege.
So it's a trap.
The trap is perfectly set. If men suppress their feelings, they are labeled toxic and emotionally stunted. If they share them, the floor drops out from under them, and they are penalized socially and romantically for displaying weakness.
It sounds like a reverse-engineered casino, where the house rules have been specifically rewritten so that the traditional ways men used to play the game now guarantee they lose.
That's a great way to put it.
And he extends this double standard far beyond just emotional expression, right? He takes this dynamic straight into the modern corporate workplace.
He does.
The book claims that society, and often a man's own family, still absolutely expects him to be the traditional provider. The baseline expectation to bring home a bacon hasn't vanished at all.
Not even a little bit.
Yet the environment where he is supposed to acquire that bacon has changed its rules entirely.
The dissonance he describes here is critical to understanding the modern male identity crisis. Riker notes that when men enter the corporate world today, they are immediately undermined by new cultural HR mandates.
Right, the corporate culture shift.
They are told to be less competitive, to prioritize collaborative consensus over decisive action, and are actively penalized for the assertive, dominant instincts that traditionally drive meritocratic success.
He paints a picture of a man being handed a massive weight to carry the expectation to provide, but having his hands tied behind his back regarding how he's actually allowed to carry it.
That captures his argument perfectly. Riker's describing a society that demands men carry the traditional burdens of masculinity while simultaneously stripping them of the traditional tools, authority, and respect historically associated with shouldering that burden.
It's a lose-lose scenario in his eyes.
Exactly. The corporate environment that used to reward the fittest, the most driven, and the most assertive has been supplanted by one that pays lip service to empathy and inclusion, rendering natural male competitiveness a literal career liability.
Wow.
Being expected to provide, but being told your natural methods for providing are toxic, is the exact friction creating the despondency he observes in modern men.
So if that's the state of the board, who does the book say flip the table?
He is very clear on this.
Yeah, Riker is incredibly pointed when he names the antagonists of this cultural shift. In Chapter 2, which is titled The Feminist Agenda Unmasked, he outlines his assertion that what might have been introduced to the public as an earnest, well-meaning attempt at equal opportunity has aggressively morphed into a push for outright female supremacy.
He views the historical progression of the movement not as a steady march toward equality, but as a bait and switch.
A bait and switch.
Yes. He argues that once basic legal and occupational equalities were achieved, the goalposts were intentionally moved. The current iteration of the movement, according to Riker, is no longer about elevating women to equal footing, but about actively subjugating men and dismantling the structures that allowed men to thrive.
And he traces the intellectual blueprint for this dismantling directly to Marxism. This seems to be a major load-bearing pillar of his overall thesis.
It is the core of his historical analysis.
How does the book connect modern feminism with Marxist ideology?
He argues that the connection is foundational. Riker claims that modern radical feminism essentially copy-pasted the Marxist framework of class struggle and mapped it onto gender.
So instead of bourgeoisie and proletariat,
It becomes men and women. In classical Marxist theory, the nuclear family is often critiqued as an economic unit designed to perpetuate capitalism, property ownership, and class divides.
right?
Riker argues that radical feminists adopted this exact lens, viewing the traditional nuclear family, specifically the dynamic where the man is the primary provider and protector, and the woman is the primary nurturer, as an inherently oppressive capitalist structure that must be destroyed to achieve their utopian ideal.
The text describes this as a quiet infection spreading through the population, fundamentally altering how men and women relate to each other.
Yes, the relational dynamic is what's targeted.
The argument is that dismantling traditional roles was never actually about freeing women from oppressive domesticity, but about capturing the societal narrative and consolidating cultural power.
That's his exact claim.
He also takes direct aim at intersectionality, which is arguably the most dominant framework in modern progressive thought. Riker refers to intersectional feminism as a complete deception.
His critique of intersectionality focuses on its practical application versus its stated intent.
Meaning what it says it does versus what it actually does.
Right.
While intersectionality claims to be a holistic framework fighting for all marginalized groups by examining overlapping systemic inequalities, Riker argues its actual function is a hierarchy of victimhood.
A hierarchy.
Yes. He claims this framework routinely positions the white upper-middle-class woman at the absolute top of the social and cultural pedestal, while actively silencing or completely ignoring the real, quantifiable struggles of men, regardless of those men's class or background.
If the framework of intersectionality is designed to highlight struggle, how does the book explain society's justification for ignoring male struggle?
Language.
Right. Riker points out that this is achieved through the weaponization of language, specifically the mainstream adoption of the term toxic masculinity.
He spends a significant portion of the text dissecting that specific phrase. Riker argues that toxic masculinity is not a clinical diagnosis, but a linguistic weapon used to pathologize completely normal male behavior.
It's used as a bludgeon. Exactly. It is a tool designed to shame men into submission, forcing them to constantly second-guess their natural instincts. But what is fascinating about his rhetorical strategy here is that he doesn't just play defense against the term.
He goes on the offensive.
He absolutely does. He introduces and defines the concept of toxic femininity.
He completely flips the script there. He points out the glaring hypocrisy of movements that extol the absolute virtues of women. You know, the future's female, believe all women, while totally ignoring the structural, lethal disadvantages that men face every day.
And he anchors this argument in some incredibly sobering data.
Yeah, the statistics he pulls are intense. The book cites that men account for 93% of all workplace deaths.
93.
They make up 77% of suicide victims. They constitute the vast, overwhelming majority of the unsheltered homeless population.
Those statistics are the cornerstone of his pushback against the concept of a universal patriarchy. Riker uses these numbers to pose a direct challenge to the reader. If Western society is truly a patriarchal construct designed top to bottom to benefit men at the direct expense of women, why are men dying on the job, taking their own lives, and sleeping on the streets at exponentially higher rates?
It's a really sharp question.
He argues that a culture that actively ignores these catastrophic outcomes while simultaneously insisting that men are the privileged, coddled oppressors is the textbook definition of toxic femininity.
He draws a very stark contrast. The book points out that women, on average, live longer, suffer far fewer workplace fatalities, have significantly lower violent crime victimization rates, and are drastically less likely to be incarcerated.
By a massive margin.
Yet they are consistently positioned by the media academia as the primary victims of society. By forcing the reader to look at these statistics, Riker is trying to shatter the baseline assumption of male privilege.
He wants the reader to see the double standard.
He's asking why extreme negative outcomes for men are dismissed as individual failures or character flaws, while any negative outcome for a woman is immediately treated as a systemic, societal injustice that requires sweeping legislation.
It is a deliberate attempt to break the lens through which his audience views societal power dynamics. Once he establishes this alternative view of who is actually suffering structurally, he moves to explain how this ideology has been operationalized.
Right, taking it from theory into reality.
This transitions the book's focus from cultural theory to physical reality, what he calls institutional capture. Riker argues that these Marxist feminist ideologies haven't just won debates on college campuses. They have systematically captured the administrative state, the legal system, and the educational infrastructure.
Because opinions on the internet are one thing, but institutional capture changes the actual rules of reality. Let's look at how he views the education system. Riker makes the case that modern schools are fundamentally anti-masculine, functioning as breeding grounds for feminist ideology rather than neutral places of learning.
To illustrate this, he provides a highly specific, grounded anecdote that serves as a microcosm for his entire view of the education system.
The story about the kid.
Right. He describes a scenario where an 8-year-old boy comes home from school with a black eye after getting into a physical altercation. The boy's mother, whom Riker specifically notes is a single mother, sits him down and strictly tells him that fighting is never the solution under any circumstances.
Which is standard parenting advice today.
Exactly. She urges him to resolve his conflicts peacefully using his words, explicitly telling him to act just like his female peers do.
It's important to note how Riker frames the mother in this story, though. He doesn't attack her as malicious.
Precisely. He describes her as earnest and well-meaning, acting on the prevailing wisdom of modern parenting. He uses this anecdote to illustrate a pervasive, inescapable cultural narrative.
That boys are just defective girls in the eyes of the system.
Essentially, yes. The argument is that young boys are being systematically conditioned from a deeply formative age to suppress their natural biological instincts. Specifically, the instincts for physical confrontation, boundary setting, and kinetic problem solving.
They're forced into a mold.
They are placed in an environment that actively demands they behave according to female developmental timelines and female behavioral norms.
And he backs this up by looking at the demographics of the teaching profession, which is overwhelmingly female, especially in early childhood and primary education. The book claims this demographic reality leads to an environment where school policies, disciplinary actions, and reward systems are heavily skewed in favor of girls.
The structural bias, according to Riker, is evident in everything from grading rubrics to recess policies. He points to a systemic leniency toward girls in disciplinary matters, contrasted with a zero-tolerance policy for typical boisterous, energetic, physically competitive boy behavior.
Right, boys being boys is now a punishable offense.
He argues that the education system treats normal boyhood as a pathology, something to be medicated with stimulants or punished with detention, rather than a natural expression of male development.
So the system is rigged from kindergarten.
The conclusion he draws is that the modern classroom is explicitly designed for girls to succeed and for boys to fail, fall behind, and eventually drop out.
From the classroom, the book zooms out to the structure of the family itself, exploring what Riker terms the war on fatherhood.
This is a really deep philosophical section.
It is, and this is where the text introduces a concept that might be entirely new to a lot of readers: anti-natalism. The book cites figures like the philosopher David Benatar and Guy Dvorkin.
For context, anti-natalism is a philosophical position, arguing that it is morally wrong to create new human life.
Which sounds extreme.
It is. The core argument, particularly in Benatar's work, is that human existence inherently and unavoidably involves suffering. Therefore, to prevent that guaranteed suffering, the only truly ethical choice is to avoid procreation entirely. It posits that it is better to never be born than to exist and experience pain.
It is an incredibly bleak, pessimistic philosophy. But the connection Riker makes is what's vital here. How does a niche philosophical concept about the ethics of procreation map onto the systemic emasculation of men?
Riker argues that antinatalism isn't just a fringe academic theory anymore. He sees it creeping into mainstream progressive thought, manifesting as climate anxiety, the glorification of the child-free lifestyle, and the general cultural pessimism about the future.
Like people saying it's irresponsible to have kids because of global warming.
Exactly that. By normalizing the idea that creating life is morally suspect, environmentally destructive, or simply a burden, society fundamentally undermines one of the absolute core biological pillars of traditional masculinity, the role of the father.
Because if the act of building a family is reframed by society as an unethical or selfish act, the man's biological imperative is essentially neutralized.
Exactly, the mechanism Riker is describing. If there is no family to build, there is no family to protect or provide for. The role of the patriarch, the protector, and the provider is rendered completely obsolete.
It deletes his purpose.
He views the mainstreaming of anti-natalist sentiment as a deliberate cultural tool used to minimize the essential nature of fatherhood, leaving men feeling purposeless and historically irrelevant.
And the book doesn't just stop at the philosophical devaluation of fatherhood. It aggressively attacks the legal reality of it. Riker is fiercely critical of the family court system.
As are many MRAs, it's a huge talking point.
He claims that the legal infrastructure surrounding divorce and child custody is heavily, undeniably biased in favor of mothers. He calls for sweeping, radical legal reform to protect fathers' rights.
He argues that under the current system, men are routinely and systematically alienated from their own children and treated by hostile courts as nothing more than walking wallets.
Stripped of authority, but carrying the financial burden.
Right, forced to bear the financial burden without any of the paternal authority.
This concept of systemic institutional neglect extends into his analysis of the healthcare system as well. Riker dedicates a portion of the text to outlining what he sees as profound healthcare bias.
He asserts that the entire medical and psychological infrastructure is fundamentally female-oriented.
How so?
Well, he argues that men's specific health issues, particularly occupational hazards stemming from those dangerous jobs we mentioned earlier, are drastically underfunded and ignored when compared to the massive cultural and financial mobilization surrounding women's health initiative.
Like the pink ribbons and all the awareness campaigns.
Exactly. Furthermore, he points to the psychiatric establishment's failure to understand or properly treat male psychological distress, which he links directly back to the staggering male suicide rates.
So therapy isn't working for men because it wasn't built for men.
The system, he argues, tries to treat depressed men like depressed women, which ultimately fails them.
So we have a picture of a modern man who is told by his culture that his instincts are toxic, told by his schools that his behavior is pathological, stripped of his authority by the family courts, and ignored by the healthcare system. Where does a man in that position turn?
According to the book, he retreats to his phone.
Which brings us to the digital realm. Riker identifies this as the primary battleground for the modern male mind. He dedicates chapter 13 to an analysis of social media, and he doesn't just view it as a waste of time, he views it as an actively emasculating algorithm.
His analysis of the digital landscape is highly mechanical. Riker argues that the algorithms powering mainstream platforms like Instagram, TikTok, or Twitter are not neutral content distributors.
They have an agenda.
He claims they are specifically designed and tuned to promote a very specific archetype, the metrosexual man.
The metrosexual.
Yes. This is a man who is highly in touch with his feminine side, who prioritizes aesthetics, consumption, and digital validation over real-world utility, and who actively suppresses traditional masculine traits.
The book suggests these platforms operate on a reward and punishment system. They artificially boost and reward men who apologize for their masculinity, who deconstruct themselves for an audience, while actively shadow banning or penalizing men who assert traditional, unapologetic masculinity.
Furthermore, Riker draws a direct causal line between the physiological decline of modern men and their social media usage.
The physical impact of the screen time.
He argues that the highly addictive, dopamine-driven nature of these apps directly contributes to male inactivity, lethargy, and the obesity epidemic.
Instead of going outside.
Instead of men going out into the physical world to build kinetic strength, master hard skills, or conquer physical challenges, they are paralyzed on their couches, endlessly scrolling, trading their biological imperative for cheap digital validation.
This leads to one of the most explosive claims in the book. Riker states that this specific digital environment is directly mathematically responsible for the birth and proliferation of the incel culture.
Involuntary celibates.
Right. He argues that these online subcultures of deeply resentful, despondent men are the inevitable byproduct of an algorithm and a culture that has so thoroughly rejected, mocked, and emasculated them that they have been completely pushed out of the sexual and social marketplace.
They haven't just opted out. Riker argues they were structurally evicted.
To explain how men can break out of this digital and cultural conditioning, Riker utilizes a metaphor that is foundational to his target audience, the Matrix. Specifically, the concept of taking the red pill from the 1999 sci-fi film.
It's the defining metaphor of the manosphere.
In the context of the book, taking the red pill represents a brutal, irreversible intellectual awakening. In the film, the pill allows the protagonist to wake up from a comfortable, simulated reality and see the real world, which is a harsh, desolate wasteland.
For Riker's readers, red pilling isn't about finding a happier life. It's about waking up to objective reality and immutable human biology.
It's a painful process.
It means violently freeing yourself from the illusions of feminist narratives. The illusions that gender is merely a social construct, that society is a patriarchy, and that men are universally privileged. Waking up to the truth that the game is entirely rigged against you.
But Riker notes that the moment a man takes this metaphorical red pill and attempts to speak these newfound truths, he hits a massive structural wall folding the assault on free speech.
The system fights back.
The text outlines how male voices that challenge the dominant feminist narrative are actively and aggressively suppressed. He points to the deplatforming of male advocates in academia, the hit pieces in mainstream media, and the suspension of accounts on major social networks.
Cancel culture.
The book claims these platforms deliberately mislabel traditional masculine viewpoints as hate speech or misogyny to justify silencing them.
The friction of speaking out is designed to be so high that most men just self-censor.
So what is Riker's structural solution to this censorship? He advocates for a total mass exodus from mainstream digital platforms. He argues that trying to fight the algorithm on Facebook or YouTube is a losing battle because the house always wins. These platforms demand conformity and trigger endless anxiety.
Instead, Riker points his readers toward the alternative tech ecosystem. He notes that there are over 65 alternative decentralized platforms available today, platforms built specifically on the ethos of absolute free speech.
So he wants them to leave.
He urges his audience to migrate to these spaces. He envisions these decentralized networks as vital digital safe havens where men can engage in uncensored discussions about masculinity, share unapproved resources, debate strategies, and build supportive, uncancelable communities, without the constant looming threat of being reprimanded by algorithmic thought police.
It's essentially advocating for digital secession, finding spaces where you don't have to walk on eggshells or self-censor every thought. But the book doesn't stop at digital safe spaces. Riker is deeply, perhaps more urgently, concerned with the physical world.
Real world territory.
In chapters 11 and 19, he focuses heavily on the invasion and systematic destruction of exclusively male environments. We are talking about the loss of traditional barbershops, hardcore lifting gyms, male-only locker rooms, the integration of the military, and the policing of college fraternities.
Riker views the loss of these spaces not as natural cultural evolution, but as a deliberate campaign by Marxist feminism and gender studies departments to dismantle male solidarity.
He sees it as targeted.
He points out what he views as a massive, glaring societal hypocrisy. He notes the recent cultural celebration and aggressive expansion of women-only gyms, female-exclusive networking spaces, and women-only co-working buildings, all of which are praised by the media as absolutely necessary, empowering safe spaces.
Right.
Yet he argues anytime men attempt to maintain or create a male-only space, it is instantly attacked by the media and legal apparatus as exclusionary, toxic, sexist, and discriminatory.
The book argues that these male-only environments are not designed to scheme against women or assert superiority. Riker claims they are necessary safe havens, where men can actually be vulnerable with one another, recharge, and learn from older mentors, without the biological and social pressure of performing for the opposite sex.
Or the constant anxiety of navigating mixed-gender HR dynamics.
Exactly. Men need places where they can simply be men without the pressure to conform to a feminized set of rules.
Which brings us to the core utility of the book. How does Riker propose men actually fight back against this overarching cultural capture?
The blueprint.
He lays out a highly specific, actionable blueprint for what he calls remasculinity. This isn't just theory. It's a strategic guide for his readers, built on 3 distinct pillars.
Let's camp on these 3 pillars, because this is where the book moves from diagnosing the problem to prescribing the cure. The first pillar is personal growth. This is the foundational level, focusing entirely on the individual. The book tells men they must become obsessed with maximizing their physical and mental potential.
Riker insists that personal sovereignty begins with physical capability. He advocates for relentless physical training, lifting heavy weights, mastering martial arts, achieving undeniable physical health.
Getting strong.
Mentally, he pushes his readers to read voraciously, focusing on history, evolutionary biology, and practical philosophy, bypassing modern academic theory entirely. He also stresses the acquisition of hard, undeniable skills trades, coding, mechanics.
Stuff that works in the real world.
The philosophy here is that by becoming indisputably competent, dangerous, and strong, a man forces the world to respect him. He argues that respect cannot be legislated or begged for. It must be extracted through undeniable utility.
You build yourself into a fortress first. Once the individual is optimized, the book moves to the second pillar, economic leverage. This is where Riker's advice becomes highly pragmatic and deeply strategic.
It's very tactical.
He notes a structural reality. Despite the cultural narrative, men still hold a vast majority of high-paying jobs, foundational trades, and leadership roles in the hard economy.
He essentially advocates for a form of secessionist economics. Riker urges his readers to weaponize their collective financial power.
Vote with their wallets, but on steroids.
Exactly. He encourages them to ruthlessly audit where their money goes, supporting only aligned companies, actively and permanently boycotting hostile or woke corporations, and divesting from institutions that push anti-male narratives.
And building their own.
More importantly, he pushes men to start their own businesses and to operate with an explicit bias toward hiring, mentoring, and funding other men. This strategy is to build parallel economic structures that are entirely insulated from cancel culture and HR mandates, leveraging the hard skills men possess to create an alternative, self-sustaining economy.
It's using capital as a shield and a sword. Finally, the third pillar of his blueprint is community building. The book acknowledges that individual excellence and financial independence aren't enough if you are isolated. Riker calls for the active, intentional creation of pro-natalist assistance networks.
These networks are designed to directly counter the anti-natalist philosophy we discussed earlier. He envisions local, decentralized groups of men that actively promote, celebrate, and financially support fatherhood and the virtues of building large families.
Really getting involved locally.
He also urges his readers to move beyond the internet and get involved in real-world MRA advocacy groups, to organize politically at the local level, and to aggressively challenge the prevailing narratives in their local school boards and city councils. He is trying to mobilize a decentralized but ideologically aligned army of men to push back against the cultural tide in their immediate physical communities.
So if a reader follows this blueprint, if he maximizes his physical potential, weaponizes his economic leverage, and builds these pro-natalist communities, what is the end game? This brings us to the conclusion of the book and Riker's ultimate vision for the future.
And it is crucial to note how he explicitly frames his final message to his audience.
Yes. The book claims it absolutely does not advocate for hostility, violence, or the use of force against women.
He states very clearly that the goal of this movement is not a regression to some cartoonish, oppressive patriarchy where women have no rights. Rather, his stated vision is a total rejection of what he terms gynocentrism.
Gynocentrism.
A societal operating system that he believes is centered entirely around female emotional needs, female perspectives, and female biological timelines at the expense of male flourishing. His ultimate stated goal is to restore a structural societal balance.
Balance is the key word for him.
He envisions a culture that brings back strength, honor, sincerity, and mutual respect between the sexes, achieved strictly by allowing men the freedom to unapologetically and powerfully inhabit their traditional biological roles without facing systemic punishment.
We have covered a massive, sprawling amount of ground today. We've meticulously unpacked the core mechanics of the new Macho. We've explored the evolutionary arguments, the vulnerability paradox, the deep critique of intersectionality and Marxism, the concept of institutional capture from the classroom to the courtroom, the push for decentralized media, and finally, Riker's highly actionable blueprint for personal, economic, and community remasculinity.
It's a lot to process.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, broader thought to ponder on your own, zooming out from the specific text of this ebook.
Yes, when we look at the sociological implications of a text like this, especially considering how deeply it resonates with its target audience, there is a structural reality we must confront. Regardless of where you stand politically, whether you find Riker's thesis compelling or completely flawed, the existence and popularity of this sentiment raises a massive question.
A huge question.
What does it actually mean for the future stability, cohesion, and productivity of a civilization when such a massive segment of its population, millions of men, feels fundamentally alienated, historically demonized, and structurally undermined by the very institutions that were built to support them?
Yeah.
When a demographic this large genuinely believes the social contract has been broken and rewritten against them, how does a culture move forward without fracturing completely?
It is a heavy, incredibly complex question, and it's one that the rising popularity of books like this suggests society is going to have to answer sooner rather than later. We want to remind you one last time, if you found this analysis fascinating, you want to read the source material for yourself to see exactly how Riker constructs his arguments and the evidence he uses, you can check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy the ebook, The New Macho.
And be sure to follow the author at the handle at Conrad Breaker on Substack to see his ongoing writings on the topic.
Engaging directly with the primary source material is always the absolute best way to grasp the subtle nuances and the mechanical logic of any cultural movement.
We highly encourage deep, critical reading of the texts that are actively shaping the worldviews of millions.
Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive, challenging deep dive into some very complex material. Before you go, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these highly detailed, impartial breakdowns of the books shaping our culture.
Thanks for listening.
We genuinely appreciate you spending your time with us, and we will see you on the next deep dive.